It's May 1536. Anne Boleyn has just been beheaded at the Tower of London. The crowd falls silent. Onlookers are shocked. Some didn't believe it would really happen. There's some hesitant cheering, some applauding. The Queen's ladies-in-waiting scream, wail, fall to the ground. One rushes forward and gathers Anne's head in a white cloth. Others drag her body from the stage. Somewhere, a cannon fires. Anne is carted away. She'll be buried in a shallow, unmarked grave. Meanwhile, as the cannon fire fades away, Henry VIII hops on a barge. His wife's decapitated body is still warm, and yet he moved on long ago. He has his sights set on another woman, Jane Seymour. By the end of the month, he'll make her his third wife. Hello, I'm Shay LaFontaine, and you're listening to History Fix. Actually, you're listening to part 2 of a 2-part episode of History Fix. So if you haven't listened to part 1 yet, you're going to want to go ahead and do that first, or this isn't going to make a whole lot of sense. In case you forgot, we're talking about the 6 wives of Henry VIII as actual people, individuals with unique stories worth telling, not just Henry's wife number whatever. In part 1, I introduced Catherine of Aragon, a Spanish princess who married Henry VIII after his older brother's death. Catherine was married to Henry for almost 24 years, somewhat happily, but out of 6 pregnancies, only 1 resulted in a living child, a girl named Mary. Henry, desperate for a male heir, decided his marriage was doomed from the start because Catherine had been married to his brother first. He goes to great lengths to secure a divorce, breaking with the Catholic Church in Rome and establishing his own Church of England. All of this to marry Anne Boleyn, one of Catherine's ladies-in-waiting. Anne is the object of Henry's desire, the perfect solution to his heir problem, until she also fails to produce a son, just another daughter, Elizabeth. Henry quickly tires of Anne, accuses her of treason, adultery, and incest with her brother, all baseless claims, and has her beheaded at the Tower of London. So we'll pick it all up from there. Now, Henry's on his way to propose to his next wife, Jane Seymour. Henry's had his eye on Jane for a little while. She was one of Anne's ladies-in-waiting, just as Anne was Catherine's lady-in-waiting. So Henry recruits Jane in the same way he did Anne. There's one account by a lady named Jane Dormer, who was one of Princess Mary's ladies-in-waiting. Jane Dormer reports that Anne Boleyn once walked in on Jane Seymour sitting on Henry's knee and freaked out on them. She was not okay with infidelity in their marriage. And she had to have been aware that if she could swoop in and replace Catherine, what's to stop someone else from swooping in and replacing her? And that's exactly what happened. I mean, kind of. Henry pursued Jane just as he had pursued Anne, and I don't know, can you really say no to the King of England? Part of me wonders how much of this was actually consensual and how much was just feeling like there was no way out. Anne and Jane also had powerful families, powerful men in their families urging them on, pushing them into the relationship with Henry to better their own positions in the court. So how much agency, how much free will did they really have? Jane couldn't have been more different than Anne. She was very submissive, quiet, plain, borderline boring. Anne was confident, outspoken, charismatic. People didn't really get what Henry saw in Jane, but I think he was trying to find the anti-Anne. Anne had obviously backfired, so he tried to go in the complete opposite direction with this marriage. He was mostly pleased with Jane. She fit the role of a queen consort. She would do, anyway. He did supposedly remark at one point that there were better-looking women at court and that perhaps he should have waited a little bit longer before settling for Jane. Which, yeah, a bit longer than 1 minute after your previous wife was executed on your orders would have been nice, but not because there are prettier women out there. Just all kinds of messed up. Like, do you even feel, Henry? Jane does not get pregnant right away. This might be why Henry seemed to be having second thoughts about the marriage. But she does set to work trying to repair and reunite Henry's broken family. She befriends Mary, they're similar ages, and she tries to get Henry to reconcile with her. Elizabeth is just a toddler, but there are records of Jane purchasing clothing for her, so she must have taken on at least somewhat of a stepmother role. Jane is fully aware that Anne's outspoken, combative nature and fierce independence are what got her killed. She's careful not to cross Henry. Except for one time. Around 5 months into their marriage, a revolt rose up called the Pilgrimage of Grace. This was in response to Henry's break with the Catholic Church. The rebels were planning to march on London, and Henry is furious. He wants revenge. How dare they even think about revolting? Jane is more sympathetic. She pleads with Henry on the rebels' behalf, suggesting he restore the monasteries to put a stop to the rebellion. And rather than consider this actual decent advice, Henry tells Jane not to make the same mistakes as Anne Boleyn or she'll meet the same demise. And that's that. She never asserts herself again. Just bends to whatever Henry wants. So yeah, if that's not psychological abuse, I don't know what is. Jane finally gives birth to a surviving son a year and a half into the marriage, Edward. Henry is ecstatic. The entire nation is ecstatic. This is what it was all for. Finally, there is an heir to the throne. But 2 weeks later, Jane succumbs to complications from the birth and dies. Her cause of death is a little unclear. It could have been an infection, often called childbed fever, but there aren't actually any reports that she had a fever. Other experts who have analyzed her symptoms suggest food poisoning combined with dehydration and eventually an embolism, which is when your blood flow gets blocked. It could be like an air bubble or a blood clot in the vein. But whatever it was undoubtedly related to a childbirth complication. Childbirth was a leading cause of death for women for much of history. At the time Jane died, the life expectancy for women was only 35, and that's entirely due to the dangers of childbirth, bringing the average down. It was an extremely dangerous and often unavoidable business. So the country is elated that little Edward, the heir to the throne, was born, and also deflated that their queen has tragically passed away. It had to have been bittersweet. According to Henry's PR, he is completely grief-stricken by the loss of his wife, but in reality, he is, quote, as merry a widower as can be found. Henry has his son. He gets over Jane very quickly and begins the search for a new wife. As a spare heir turned king himself, he understands the importance of a second son. Although they were only married for 18 months, Henry does honor Jane in a couple of ways. He has her painted into a family portrait posthumously. So this is when he's married to his sixth wife, Catherine Parr. But rather than include Catherine in the portrait, he has the artist paint Jane next to him with Edward, Mary, and Elizabeth. And you can see this portrait and a bunch of other portraits on my Instagram at HistoryFix Podcast. He's also buried next to Jane after his death. So I don't know. I don't actually think this means he loved Jane the most. She's just the one who gave him his son. So he kind of had to put on this show to really legitimize the marriage and therefore his heir. So Henry's in the marriage market again, and I have to imagine he's pleased. I think he liked wife hunting more than he actually liked having a wife. But this time, he takes a more traditional route. He has Thomas Cromwell, his advisor, arrange a diplomatic marriage. So this is the way it's usually done, the way Catherine's marriage to Arthur was arranged as a political alliance. But this is a first for Henry. All of his wives so far he's met before the marriage. He got to know them, fell in love, maybe, or at least lust, before they were married. Now he's going old school. England is still in hot water with the Catholic world. The Catholics aren't exactly pleased with Henry. He started his own Protestant church, joined the Protestant Reformation. Remember, that was the only way to get out of his first marriage to Catherine of Aragon. So Cromwell decides they need an alliance with another Protestant country. They need backup. He chooses Cleves, which is a small duchy in what is now Germany. Back then, Germany was just a collection of regions, territories called duchies. So a duchy is an area ruled by a duke or duchess as a sovereign state, like an independent little country almost. The Duke of Cleves has a daughter named Anne of Cleves. Now, Cleves is a pretty small fried duchy. It's not a super impressive or powerful ally. But at this point, most of Europe is very wary of Henry. He doesn't exactly have a great track record with his past wives. When Princess Christina of Denmark and Norway was approached, she responded, quote, "If I had two heads, one should be at the King of England's disposal." Ouch. So Cleves it is. But Cromwell thinks Cleves is a smart match for another reason. They've also rejected the Pope. In fact, Anne's older sister is married to one of the heads of a defense alliance of Protestant states, so that's a good guy to be related to if you're Henry. But Henry has never met Anne of Cleves. She's the only match he hadn't pre-approved, and this makes him nervous. He's quite shallow and vain, and he worries that Anne won't be pretty enough. Now, I need to point out that while Henry was a looker in his youth, I don't find his earlier portraits that impressive, but I guess he was handsome for contemporary standards. Now he's kind of gross. Sorry, but he is. He's getting old. He's like 47, which is basically an old man in the 1500s. He's also very overweight and out of shape. It's said that 3 of the biggest men at court could fit inside his doublet, a 50-inch waist. He's been in bad health since his jousting accident, suffers from chronic pain, ulcers, and an oozing pussy infection on his leg that won't go away. He's not a tall drink of water anymore. But for a fat old man, he is very concerned about what Anne of Cleves looks like. So he sends an artist to paint her portrait. Actually, he sends the artist, the portrait painter guy, Hans Holbein. Everyone who was anyone had their portrait painted by Hans Holbein. Holbein apparently has a hard time getting access to Anne. All of the English ambassadors have had a hard time. The culture is quite different in Cleves. Young women do not mix with men. Anne is kept fairly sheltered, isolated almost with her mother and siblings. She's also not super educated. English girls weren't either, really, but they did learn skills like singing and dancing. They may have learned to read and write, possibly another language like Greek or Latin, just like the really useful ones. Now, Catherine of Aragon, remember, she was from Spain, and she was highly educated in the same way that boys are educated in England. In Cleves, girls learned needlepoint? Yeah, that's about it. Anne only speaks German, and she's had very little exposure to the world. But Holbein manages to paint the portrait, and it's stunning, iconic. Henry is very impressed. I have this portrait on my Instagram, @HistoryFixPodcast, along with portraits of basically everyone, so you'll want to check those out. Henry is like, yep, I'll take her, and Anne of Cleves begins the long journey to England. Although she doesn't speak any English, she's well liked by the men accompanying her on the journey. She's kind and easy to please. She's very chill. She dines with the men, which had to have been outside her comfort zone. And she asks, through a translator, she asks to be taught a card game that Henry likes to play so that they'll have something to do together. Anne is eager to learn and eager to please. She arrives in England and is staying in Rochester on her way to meet Henry in London. But Henry decides he just can't wait. He still fancies himself a bit of a fairy tale knight, so he decides he's going to basically bust in on Anne in disguise, and if she is his true love, she'll recognize him, and they'll just fall into each other's arms, and it'll be the start of this fairy tale romance. So he does this. He bursts into Anne's chamber and kisses her on the lips, and Anne doesn't recognize him. She's terrified that this strange man has forced himself on her, and by one account, she even slaps him. And Henry is devastated. This is a disaster of a first meeting. By the time Anne realizes who he is, it's too late. But she's never seen him before. She legit did not know the man was Henry. Did he want her to be okay with kissing a strange man? I think, if anything, it speaks to her character that she was so horrified by it. But whatever, it really is a disaster, and I think the relationship was ruined at that point before it even began. Henry went to Cromwell pretty immediately and remarked, quote, "I like her not." But at that point, there's nothing they could do. The marriage contract with Anne was rock solid. Henry had to marry her. And it was actually his most elaborate public wedding, ironically. Henry complains that Anne is not as described. Now, he never calls her ugly, and no one ever says that Anne doesn't look like the portrait Holbein painted, just that she was, quote, "not as described." But for some reason, Anne of Cleves has gone down in history as the ugly wife. And I don't think that's fair. First of all, it doesn't really matter. It shouldn't matter what she looks like. I mean, look at Henry. But also, I kind of don't think she was ugly. I'll tell you what I think actually went down. Henry was unable to consummate the marriage. This is a fact. We know this because it comes out later. He claims he's unable to perform his marital duties because he's just not feeling Anne. He doesn't like her. She's just not doing it for him. He doesn't call her ugly, but it's implied. But actually, Henry is most likely impotent at this point, physically unable to perform in the bedroom, if you catch my drift. Rumors of this surfaced during the trial of Anne Boleyn. She made a comment suggesting that Henry was suffering from impotence. It also explains why it took so long for Jane Seymour to get pregnant. And remember, he even made a comment about Jane not being pretty enough. He keeps trying to blame it on his wives, but I think the problem is with Henry. I think he would have consummated the marriage with Anne of Cleves if he could. I mean, he's come this far. He's brought her from Cleves. He's married her. She very likely could have provided him with that spare heir. Henry just flat out can't. And the history the men wrote down twists that into Anne of Cleves wasn't pretty enough to tempt Henry into her bed. I'm calling BS on that. But Henry decides to use this, the fact that the marriage hadn't been consummated, along with an old pre-contract of marriage Anne had to another man he managed to dig up, as grounds for an annulment. He wants out of the marriage. He's going to get himself out. He sends Anne off to Richmond Palace, telling her there's a plague in London and she'll be safer there, which is a lie. And soon the king's ambassadors arrive in the middle of the night, bust into her room, and tell her the king has doubts about their marriage and that there will be a trial. So, like, intimidation tactics much? I mean, this is ridiculous. Anne is terrified. She's screaming and crying. She's well aware of what happened to Anne Boleyn after her trial and Catherine of Aragon after hers. She had to have been scared out of her mind at this point. But she decides to handle the situation much differently than Anne Boleyn and Catherine of Aragon. Anne and Catherine both flat out refused to accept that Henry wanted to end their marriages or execute them. They were not willing to compromise, even a tiny bit. They refused to give in to Henry. Anne of Cleves goes the other direction with it. She doesn't agree with it. She thinks she's Henry's rightful wife, but she goes along with it, basically to save herself. And it works. After only 6 months of marriage, Henry successfully annuls his marriage to Anne of Cleves. Now, part of the settlement states that Anne has to stay in England. She can't go home, like ever. They can't have her going back to Cleves and claiming to be the Queen of England. They have to be able to keep an eye on her in case she ever decides to double-cross Henry and the annulment. Also, no one is going to marry her now. She's basically ruined as far as the marriage market goes. It's social suicide to marry a divorced woman, especially one who's been cast off by the king himself. So this sounds bad, but honestly, Anne of Cleves makes off like a bandit compared to Henry's other wives. Henry, likely pleased that Anne just gave him what he wanted, gives her the status of a king's sister, which is super high ranking. She's right below Mary and Elizabeth, the king's daughters, at court. She gets all these palaces and properties, including Hever Castle, which was actually Anne Boleyn's childhood home. She's provided a large income. She's welcome at court. She lives a lavish life of luxury. She enjoys a lot more freedom and independence than she's ever had before, but also I'd expect more freedom than a married woman even. And she kind of falls into this weird loophole of cast-off wife, but wait, this is actually so much better, like, I'll take it. She's good friends with Mary and Elizabeth, and actually when Mary is later crowned queen, Anne rides in the second chariot with Elizabeth. So this just really shows how much of a part of the family she became, and how influential and really powerful she ended up being despite her disastrous 6-month marriage to Henry. Thomas Cromwell does not fare quite as well. Remember, Cromwell was Henry's advisor who arranged the marriage to Anne of Cleves. He doesn't go down for that, though. Henry actually forgave him for the marriage mistake and made him Earl of Essex after that. He actually gets executed for suspicions of treason and heresy that were probably completely false. Actually, some believe rumors were spread by Cromwell's rivals out of jealousy after he received that title, Earl of Essex. Henry, now paranoid that Cromwell was plotting against him, had him arrested and beheaded without a trial. But Henry regretted that hasty decision pretty much immediately, later referring to Cromwell as the most faithful servant he had ever had. And I just find it so ironic indeed that Cromwell, he was the one who spread false accusations about Anne Boleyn, leading to her execution. And now he's had the very same thing done to him by his own jealous foes. I just have a hard time feeling sorry for him after that. But also, Henry will chop your head off at the drop of a hat, apparently. And that takes us to our next wife, Catherine Howard. Can you feel the foreshadowing? Catherine Howard came from the Howard family, which was quite high-ranking, so she's of noble birth. But her father was actually in a lot of debt. She didn't have the same financial opportunities and cushy upbringing as the rest of her extended family. She's actually the cousin of Anne Boleyn, and her uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, secures her a position as maid of honor to Anne of Cleves. So once again, we see Henry handpicking his next wife from among his current wives, ladies-in-waiting. Henry marries Catherine Howard on the exact same day that his trusted advisor, Thomas Cromwell, is executed. Yeah, he may have been a sociopath. I don't know. He's at least very good at compartmentalizing his feelings in order to seemingly not care at all about some seriously heavy stuff. Catherine is very young, possibly as young as 16, when she marries Henry, and he's nearing 50. She was quite beautiful. He was very into her looks. Maybe he thought that would get him out of his slump of sexual dysfunction. I don't know. But Catherine is basically a child. Henry calls her his rose without a thorn and showers her with gifts. Despite her age, she adapts to the role of queen consort quite well and is actually well received by the people. She does not get along with Henry's children, though. Mary is not a fan. Mary's older than Catherine by almost 10 years, so I'm sure she was royally annoyed by all of this and likely eye-rolling her father and his choices by now. Elizabeth is still a child. She's like 7 years old, and Catherine seems to favor her because she's the daughter of Catherine's cousin, Anne Boleyn. Elizabeth and Catherine are blood relatives. And then there's Anne of Cleves, still hanging around the court, but Catherine receives her kindly, which is a classy move. But some pretty nasty rumors start swirling not long at all after the marriage. First, Thomas Culpeper, who was a member of Henry's privy chamber, so that's a high-ranking courtier, there are rumors that he visited Catherine's room several times while Henry was away. Catherine would send one of her ladies, Lady Rochford, to invite Culpeper to her room. She also wrote several letters to Culpeper, signed, quote, "Yours as long as life endures." So there's that. But then other nasty rumors emerge about Catherine's past. When she was 13, she was sexually abused by her music teacher, Henry Mannix, and later by her grandmother's secretary, Frances Derham. She lived with her grandmother at the time, probably because of the financial turmoil her father was in. The relationship with Derham was particularly damning as it was ongoing and long-lasting. Questions arose about whether Catherine and Derham had a pre-contract to marry, which could make her marriage to Henry invalid. It's exactly what he used to get rid of Anne of Cleves. So these rumors start to surface. Then Derham actually shows up at court demanding to be part of Catherine's household. She allows him, probably just to appease him and keep him from spilling the beans, but it definitely raises some eyebrows. So between Culpeper visiting her room and Derham showing up at court, the scandal is now reaching a fever pitch. The Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, I feel like everyone is named Thomas in this story, he finally decides to tell Henry about it. He's like, I gotta tell him. He's literally going to kill me if he finds out I knew and I didn't say anything. So he writes Henry a note, and it all blows up. Henry storms out of Hampton Court in a fit of rage. He's devastated, betrayed. He was very satisfied with Catherine as his wife. So he's completely heartbroken by the news of her infidelity, which, I mean, kind of a taste of his own medicine now? Is anyone else not feeling bad for Henry at all? Isn't this exactly what he's done to almost all of his wives? He wasn't exactly a faithful husband to any of them. So Anne Boleyn was executed for adultery, which was probably not true. Catherine Howard is now being accused of adultery and premarital relations, which is probably actually true. But I want to pause the narrative for a minute to remind you that Catherine is 16 years old. So let's update the context here to the modern age. At the time, Catherine was likely seen as promiscuous, sinful, lustful, slutty, if you will. Through a modern lens, I see a child, 13 years old, abused by her music teacher, a grown man in a position of power over her. I see a not much older than that child, maybe 14 when it started, abused by an employee of her household, a grown man in a position of power over her. And this relationship was ongoing. He groomed her, followed her to court. And then I see a 16-year-old now married to a man 30 years her senior, King of England, can't say no to him, and a high-ranking man of the court, Thomas Culpeper, who had been accused of rape in the past, by the way, but pardoned. Now he's trying to grab his piece of the pie. Because despite Catherine's invitations and letters to Culpeper, there are indications that she was actually terrified of him. She's quite pleading in her letter. She says, "I pray you," 3 times. There's a clear power dynamic, and Culpeper is obviously on top. Later, Catherine told her interrogators that Culpeper ceaselessly begged for a meeting, and she was too fearful to refuse. So, through a modern lens, this is not a sinful and unfaithful wife, consensual, complicit in these acts of infidelity. This is a child, groomed, abused, taken advantage of by men in positions of power. Culpeper and Derham both had serious motives to maintain their relations with Catherine. Henry was getting old. He was in poor health. Catherine was soon to be a very wealthy and young widow in need of a man to manage all that wealth. They 100% took advantage of her for their own gain. And as a victim of sexual abuse since the age of 13, Catherine is powerless to stop it. She is a victim. But that's certainly not how Henry sees it. He sends a messenger to Catherine to tell her that if she comes clean about everything, he'll be merciful. So she does come clean. She admits to everything during her interrogation. Derham, Culpeper, all of it. And Henry is not at all merciful. He's completely humiliated, and he wants revenge. Culpeper is beheaded. Derham is hanged, drawn, quartered, castrated, and disemboweled, like overkill much. Catherine is condemned to die without a trial, along with Lady Rochford, who had helped to orchestrate the rendezvous with Thomas Culpeper. The night before her execution, Catherine asks that the executioner's block be brought to her room so she can practice getting into position. Which, if that isn't just the most heartbreaking thing. She's a wreck at her execution, not at all like Anne Boleyn, who stoically held her neck out for the sword. Also, Catherine is beheaded with an axe, not a sword, which is decidedly less merciful. Then, Lady Rochford has to lay her own head on the same block immediately after Catherine's execution, warm blood and all. It's just all very intense and unnecessary, especially when you consider they were guilty of nothing Henry hadn't done himself. The double standard is infuriating. After Catherine Howard's execution, Henry descends into a deep depression. He's having a midlife crisis. He's been having a midlife crisis. Actually, I guess it's a late life crisis. He's in his early 50s now, which is considered old age. He chooses a final wife from among his daughter Mary's ladies-in-waiting, named Catherine Parr. This Catherine is in her early 30s. She's been married twice before, twice a widow. And I think Henry's looking more for companionship at this point than anything else. They don't really have a romantic relationship. Catherine is more of an intellectual partner to him. She's very intelligent. She likes to read. She's actually a published author. She was the first woman in England to publish in English under her own name. But Catherine Parr wasn't interested in marrying Henry at all. She was in love with Thomas Seymour, the brother of Henry's third wife, Jane Seymour. She agreed to marry Henry because, as I've said several times already, you can't really say no to the King of England. If he wants to marry you, he's going to marry you. But also, I think she looked at it like a duty she was doing for her country, caring for its lonely, ailing king at the end of his life. And she also cares for his children as if they were her own. She's a proper stepmother to them. Catherine is a very capable queen. Henry actually leaves her in charge as queen regent in 1544 when he goes off on some exploit in France, something he hasn't done since Catherine of Aragon way back when. Catherine Parr is intelligent and independent, and it almost gets her into a lot of trouble, actually. Catherine is a bit of a Protestant religious reformer, and she starts pushing the idea that religious texts should be written in English, so the common man can read and understand them, which I guess wasn't done. I guess it was also apparently a problem because it was a very controversial idea. She's writing about it and publishing these scandalous ideas she has, and it starts to freak Henry out a little bit. Catherine, she catches on, though, and she notices that Henry is becoming colder and more distant, and she reels him right back in. She turns on the passive, submissive wife setting and is like, oh, I have so much to learn from you. I was only doing this for you. I thought it would be a good distraction from the pain you're always in. Please teach me how to be better. And just completely manipulates Henry right back into her good graces. Someone actually comes to arrest Catherine for this while she's having this discussion with Henry. And he's like, arrest her? On whose order? Even though he was totally the one who gave the order. And Catherine is saved. She's bested him, really. She's outmaneuvered him mentally and politically by letting him think he's superior to her when really she's in the driver's seat. Catherine hopes to be made Queen Regent when Henry dies until his son Edward is old enough to rule on his own, because he's like 9 right now. But unfortunately, that's not how it goes down. Henry's health is failing. He's on his deathbed at this point where he mutters, quote, "Pardon me all my sins, though they were greater than can be." Which, yeah, you think? And after he dies, Catherine is made Queen Dowager, which is just like the widow of the dead king. She has no power, basically. She doesn't get that Queen Regent distinction that she wanted. Instead, Henry leaves a group of men in charge until Edward comes of age. Predictable, no? But Edward, I mean, yeah, he's a boy, he's a male heir, but he's not all that. He's always been sickly. He rules for 6 years, and then he dies at the age of 15, probably of tuberculosis, at which point Mary takes the throne. But not without challenges. When Edward dies, the powers that be try to place his Protestant cousin, Lady Jane Grey, on the throne. And Mary is like, She gathers support, rides into London, and rightfully takes her throne. The first female to rule England, the first queen in her own right. Mary had a strong agenda. She wanted to restore the Roman Catholic faith in England, which is, what her father destroyed in order to divorce her mother. So she's like, yeah, we'll go ahead and undo that. Mary only ruled for 5 years, but in that time, she became rather notorious for her ruthless defense of Catholicism. She had around 280 Protestants burned at the stake for refusing to convert to Catholicism, and another 800 fled the country. She earned the nickname Bloody Mary for this religious persecution. Yeah, like the cocktail. So that sounds awful, but history journalist Maylin Sali sums it up pretty nicely in a Smithsonian Magazine article titled The Myth of Bloody Mary when she says, quote, "The Tudor Queen is remembered as one of the most reviled figures in English history, Bloody Mary. This is a story of how a heroic underdog became a monarch who was then mythologized as a violent despot, despite being no bloodier than her father, Henry VIII, or other English monarchs. It's a tale of sexism, shifting national identity, and good old-fashioned propaganda, all of which coalesce to create the image of an unchecked tyrant that endures today," end quote. And really, it's pretty predictable. You can't really expect them to paint England's first queen in a positive light. That would be a huge blow to the patriarchy, which had maintained forever that women could not rule. Mary died childless in 1558 after acknowledging Elizabeth as her heir. Elizabeth was Protestant, so this was probably hard for Mary to pass the throne to a Protestant queen after all she had done to restore Catholicism. But they were sisters, and they really did have a good relationship despite it all. Elizabeth ruled for 45 years as one of the most successful and admired monarchs of all time. She brought England into its golden age of economic prosperity, exploration, art, and literature. We're talking William Shakespeare, the defeat of the Spanish Armada, the first English colony in the Americas. They couldn't even try to twist her story to demonize her like they did Mary. She was undeniably one of the greats, man or woman. Elizabeth never married. She didn't want to share her throne with a man who would have inevitably been seen as superior to her. And honestly, I have to imagine the concept of marriage itself was a bit tainted for her after witnessing her father's shenanigans. So Elizabeth never had any children. The Tudor line ended with her death in 1603. And I feel like this was her final FU to her father, who went to such horrifying lengths to secure an heir. Elizabeth was just like, nah, not gonna. And she was buried next to Mary in Westminster Abbey beneath the inscription, "Partners both in throne and grave, here rest we two sisters, Elizabeth and Mary, in the hope of the resurrection." And I love that they loved each other in the end. And really, we have Jane Seymour, Anne of Cleves, and Catherine Parr to thank for that. They all went to great lengths to unite the royal family and rebuild those familial bonds between the siblings. And so when I look back on this whole saga of love and betrayal, lust, conspiracy, abuse, and murder, I have so many feels with this one. This story really illustrates so many issues with the traditional Western society and the way that it's always been done. The imbalance of power between men and women is the root of all evil in this story. If Henry wasn't so desperate for a male heir, if Mary had been enough for him, if Elizabeth had been enough for him, none of this would have gone down the way it did. And history laughs in his face with Elizabeth, honestly, a far better ruler than he was. I have to imagine her mother, Anne Boleyn, is smiling in her unmarked grave still at that. So really the lesson here is, do not underestimate the power of women, even in times of extreme oppression and gender inequality. Henry had the patriarchy on his side. That's how he was able to do what he did. But when you really strip this story down, when you strip it bare and read between the lines, you have 6 women: Catherine, Anne, Jane, Anne, Catherine, and Catherine. Actually, 8 women: Mary and Elizabeth. 8 women who really had the upper hand for their righteousness, determination, honesty, intelligence, integrity, and overwhelming strength in the face of unjust betrayal, persecution, and death. Thank you all so very much for listening to History Fix. I hope you found this story interesting and maybe you even learned something new. Be sure to follow my Instagram at History Fix Podcast to see some images that go along with this episode and to stay on top of new episodes as they drop. I'd also really appreciate it if you'd rate and follow this podcast on whatever app you're using to listen. That'll make it much easier to get your next fix. Information used in this episode was sourced from a History Extra podcast series called 6 Wives, Tudor Times, the Tudor Society, localhistories.org, Historic Royal Palaces, EnglishHistory.net, Smithsonian Magazine, Royal Museums Greenwich, and Encyclopedia Britannica Online. Links to all these sources can be found in the show notes.